Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today's Sunday, and today we're going to be ripping hard and relentlessly those believers in 8 functions models, those believers in unconscious personalities, and all of that. Why 8 function models make no sense. More of a polemical approach today. Before that, remember that I've written 2 books, The Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, available down below, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle, also less than $10, available below. Support me with my work. So, why do 8 function models make no sense? This is obviously a topic that I've discussed before, and I keep returning to it from time to time. Usually I return to it when I have gleaned more insights into the case. In this case, the insights that I've been gleaning have been mostly from my reading of Jung at the moment. I don't know if this is something that I have told you before, but I lay my hands on the collected works of Carl Jung in 20 volumes, essentially all the works apart from the autobiography, which I have already read, and the Red Book, which I have not read yet, but on which I have been listening to some lectures, and hopefully I will get to read the Red Book soon. But in any case, reading Jung always throws light on a lot of those topics, and it's sometimes good to go back to basics because the works of Jung go into so much more detail than the works of Myers-Briggs, for instance. 8 function models are popular in certain areas, and there are even models online that profess to follow an 8 function model. And I always have had suspicions towards them, towards the fact that they don't quite make sense, and I just wanted to provide yet another angle from which we can establish that they very likely don't make a lot of sense, these 8 function models. Now, when I was reading an essay by Jung recently, there was a very useful paragraph where, I think there was an essay written in preparation for a lecture, and he gives a definition of the unconscious. And he said, broadly speaking, that the unconscious is an area of the psyche where the contents are not defined and energetically invested enough to reach consciousness, right? So not defined and determined and energetically invested enough to reach the threshold of consciousness. Doesn't mean that there are no contents in the unconscious. It simply means that, they're not quite determined enough with libido or psychic energy to become conscious. Unconscious contents in many cases can become conscious. This is the journey of individuation. This is the journey of integration. But as long as they are not conscious, they are unconscious. And there is an area of that unconscious, which really has to do with the personal unconscious, everything that has to do with our life. And within that personal unconscious, there is what we call the shadow complex, which is a complex made of what we don't like about ourselves, essentially, what we repress about ourselves. And integrating the shadow complex is also part of the journey of individuation. Now, what is important to understand and appreciate from this perspective is that a complex in the unconscious is a psychic entity, a psychic object made up of different psychic units that come together that may refer to certain feelings of shame and certain references to your past and so on. They come together to form a unitary entity called the complex. The complex comes with what Jung consistently refers to as a feeling tone. The concept of a feeling tone is very important. It's a concept that he didn't invent. It was, I've been able to verify from my readings so far that feeling tone was a concept that was very much in the everyday academic vocabulary of psychiatrists and psychologists at the time that Jung was writing, and he's still using that concept, you know, in psychological types. Talks a lot about the feeling tone. What's a feeling tone? As the name, you know, as the word suggests, a feeling tone is a certain quality of emotion that comes with a particular complex. In other words, in your consciousness and in your unconscious, so in both sides of your psyche, the contents of it have a feeling tone. So obviously, if let's say that in my unconscious, let's say that in my conscious mind, I see myself as an industrious and dutiful person who's reliable and loving and disciplined, right? Let's say that these are, you know, sort of how I consider myself and how I think I'm perceived. I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just giving an example. Now, in the unconscious, the mechanism of compensation, which is inseparable from the idea of psychic balance, necessitates that there will be feelings of inadequacy, unreliability that refer to specific facts. For example, perhaps, you know, I forgot to empty the bin today, or I forgot to do the cleaning I was supposed to do, or I forgot to get in touch with this friend. I have been delaying getting in touch with that other friend for months and I keep doing it. Maybe there's something that, you know, I should have told my partner earlier than I did and I kind of feel bad about it. And I repress all those aspects. These are the counterbalancing effects, the compensating effects of all these otherwise positive sides of me that I have in my conscious mind, that I have, you know, allowed to get above the threshold of consciousness. Now, in the shadow are going to be these compensating effects if they have a strong feeling tone. In other words, if the emotions associated with them are intense, intensely unpleasant, shameful, upsetting, fearsome, whatever it might be, that increases the likelihood that they form an individual complex. And an individual complex tends to, one of the core elements of that individual complex in the unconscious is that it tends to act autonomously. In other words, that it tends to have its own psychic existence. It's split off from our ego in the unconscious. When people speak of a split off personality, what that means usually, it's not that they have a split off autonomous complex that is in the unconscious, because we all have that. Hence why we have Freudian slips of the tongue, slips of the pen, hence why we have dreams that really concern us, or that really we can't quite make sense of without being, making reference to those complexes. In a sense, the autonomous life that we have in dreams are, expressions, symbolic expressions of the autonomous life of our complexes in the unconscious. But we speak of a split off personality in the case of mental illness when the complex just has been repressed to such an extent that it breaks out into consciousness. Okay? And so by breaking out into consciousness, it takes the seat of the ego. And the ego comes back from time to time, but it always has to fight for the driver's seat with the now broken into consciousness complex. That's where we speak of dissociation, when we speak of a split off personality. But this is a case of illness linked to the complex having broken into consciousness. That's actually a sign of mental illness. So usually our complexes exist. They're compensatory mechanisms. They have a strong feeling tone. They tend to organize into relatively autonomous entities in the unconscious. They don't really break into consciousness directly. They can do so indirectly through slips and obviously dreams and fantasies we may have when we're daydreaming. This is not to the extent of having like a pathological tendency to fantasize and become completely alienated and solipsistic about the world and having lost the adaptive ability to be in the world and to cope with the world. If we were to assume that we have an 8-function model with a shadow complex, essentially that has its 4 functions that are in the unconscious, we are essentially saying that the shadow is an autonomous entity that has its own personality and that the elements of that personality can be broken down into functions. So for example, if I'm an INFJ and I have NIFE, TI, SE as my conscious functional makeup, the shadow complex in the unconscious will have, according to a lot of models, a functional makeup or function stack of NE, FI, TE, SI. Now, apart from the fact that these functions, as they are set forward for my supposed hypothetical shadow complex, are completely arbitrary, they look nice and symmetrical, and I am assuming that's why they are tempting for a lot of people to embrace or to follow, modelers and theorists with inverted commas that promote those symmetrical views. They're arbitrary, and there's no particular reason to assume that that's what actually obtains in the shadow complex. There's another reason, and that I'm coming to my point, my main point in this video, which is why does it not really make sense? Well, the reason why it doesn't really make sense is that the irony is the shadow complex, which exists, we can admit that it exists, is in the unconscious. When we give it a particular functional makeup, a function stack, instead of capturing the shadow complex itself, we are giving an interpretation by our conscious ego. In other words, an interpretation by our NIFETI stack of what the shadow complex is. We are projecting our own conscious ability to discriminate and provide a detailed, integrated definition of what functions are onto a complex which is by its very nature and the very fact that it is in the unconscious, is way less determined, way less separated. It's important to understand what's in the unconscious is not determined to the extent that it can reach consciousness, because it lacks enough psychic energy that's invested in it to reach that threshold and to become discriminative and determined. There is something that Jung constantly goes back to. He says, whatever is lower in definition, you can imagine like a screen in high definition, that's how we perceive reality. What's in the unconscious is much lower definition. It's much, much lower definition, which is partly why in dreams everything gets mixed up. As soon as there is a vague analogy between one thing and another, in dreams they seem to kind of become identified and mix up. And so our dreams, they both seem to have a kind of narrative, but they're also very symbolic and don't seem to make complete sense because the different categories in our unconscious are not high definition. They tend to merge into other categories that, because they're also not high definition, become united. If you like, they're different, but because they are low definition, there's a tendency for the unconscious mind to bring them together. In these circumstances, this very defining and overarching characteristic of unconscious contents makes it strictly impossible to tell whether there is a distinction as specific, distinctive, and determined as a distinction between an FI function and a TI function, or an SI function and an NE function. These, by definitions, are highly individuated concepts that are just not adequate to capture what our unconscious complexes consists of, including the shadow complex. And that just makes it not only arbitrary, but illogical and contradictory to assimilate these contents with highly differentiated functions, which is why when we do that, we're just projecting our conscious contents onto what we think are our unconscious contents. Possibly this has been dense and technical. I hope that everyone will make an effort to really appreciate the point here, because I think that it just deals a massive blow, if that needed to be dealt, to the idea of a full-blown 8-function model reliant on the notion of a shadow personality with its own shadow functions. There is a shadow complex. In some metaphorical sense, it has an autonomous personality, but it's a very much undifferentiated personality. Just look at your dreams. Would you say that you see like a function stack, a well-defined function stack in your dreams? It's symbolic, it merges, it blends. This is what it does. It's archaic. It's the source of myth. And there's a reason why it is that. It is not the source of our highly individuated, differentiated ego. There's a difference between the two. And this is why the 4-function model makes a lot more sense. If you wanted an 8-function model, you'd have to somehow make it definitive of an entire conscious personality. Your unconscious personality is only a personality as an image. And insofar as it has autonomous influence on what you do, but it's not a personality in the same sense, and it's important that you appreciate this in order to not be misled in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments, guys, and I will hear from you next week. Bye-bye.